The night he was born was quieter than most, as though the world itself had pressed a finger to its lips. The village lay under a blanket of soft mist, lamps flickering like tired eyes. Yet above, the sky was restless, shifting in ways no one could explain. It wasn't thunder that stirred the clouds, nor wind that bent the stars into trembling arcs. It was something softer, like voices carried from a distance, woven together in a strange lullaby. Some swore later that the constellations seemed to bend, gathering closer, whispering among themselves. The boy's grandmother was the first to notice it. She had always believed the night sky carried messages for those willing to listen, and as she held the newborn close, she swore she heard words, not clear but shaped in a language her heart understood. The stars did not shout. They murmured, they crooned, they promised. She bent her ear to the child, and in the rhythm of his breath she thought she heard the same melody echoing faintly. It was as if he had arrived carrying a piece of that sky song within him. She didn't tell the others. Some truths are too fragile to be spoken aloud. In the years that followed, he grew quietly, almost unnoticed by the noise of the world. His laughter was soft, like wind brushing tall grass. He rarely cried. Instead, when he grew restless, he would gaze upward, as though searching for something only he remembered. The villagers began to whisper. They said the child carried strangeness, that sometimes, when the nights grew still, he seemed to hum without opening his mouth, and the lamps flickered in answer. His eyes caught light differently, as though they had their own reflection of the stars, and yet he was no prodigy, no miracle in the way people might imagine. He was simply gentle. He listened longer than he spoke. He lingered in silence, as though silence itself was teaching him. One night, when he was still small enough to be carried, his grandmother brought him outside under the wide sky. She pointed upward at the constellations and whispered, "Do you hear them?" The boy leaned his head against her shoulder and nodded. He did not hear words, not exactly, but there was a rhythm, a soft thread pulling at his chest, like the world breathing with him. He reached out a tiny hand as though he could catch the sound and tuck it into his pocket. That was when he first noticed something no one else did, a faint shimmer at the edge of the horizon, like a doorway of light, just waiting to open. He could not name it then. He only felt its pull. From that night onward, the boy carried the memory of the sky speaking. It lingered not in sound, but in the way he dreamed, the way he moved through the days with quiet patience. It was the first secret of his life, the knowledge that the world was not empty, but humming softly, waiting for him to answer. And though he did not know it yet, that night was only the beginning. The stars had whispered not to announce greatness, but to remind him that even the smallest life can be woven into a song that stretches across eternity. He fell asleep that night under his grandmother's watchful gaze, the lullaby of the heavens echoing faintly in his breath. Somewhere above, the constellations tilted closer, as if listening to the dreams of the boy who would one day learn to listen back. The house where he grew up was not grand. It leaned slightly, as if it too were tired of standing for so long. Its walls creaked when the wind pressed against them, and its windows fogged easily in the chill of dawn. But to the boy, none of that mattered. What mattered was the room at the very end of the hallway, the room where sound behaved differently. It was small, no bigger than a cupboard, with faded wallpaper that curled at the edges. Yet whenever he entered, the air shifted. His footsteps did not vanish into silence. They returned to him, softened, as though the room was trying to hold his sounds gently in its palms. If he whispered, his voice came back not louder, not haunting, but tender, like a mother repeating her child's words in reassurance. At first he thought it was only his imagination, but the older he grew, the more he realized that this room listened. When he laughed, it hummed back faintly as if pleased. When he cried, it wrapped his sobs in echoes so soft they almost felt like comfort. His grandmother told him that some rooms carry memory. "Wood remembers," she said, running her hand over the beams. "It soaks up the sounds of life, and sometimes, if you're quiet enough, it gives them back." The boy believed her. In the still hours of afternoon, when the rest of the house slept, he would sit cross-legged in that room and murmur small secrets to the walls. Nothing important, just dreams, small fears, the names of clouds he invented for himself. And always the room gave something back, turning loneliness into a kind of companionship. One evening, after a long day of storms, he entered the room with a heaviness he couldn't name. He pressed his forehead to the wall and asked softly, "Will I always feel strange?" For a long while there was only silence, then faintly his own words returned, "Feel strange," but they were altered somehow, gentler, warmer, like a promise instead of a question. He understood then that the room was not mocking him. It was reminding him that his strangeness was not emptiness, but a song the world had not yet learned to sing. As the years passed, the boy discovered that the echoes shaped his dreams. Sometimes he heard whispers in his sleep, familiar phrases, wrapped in voices not his own, as though past generations had left little fragments of themselves in those walls. He never told anyone, not even his grandmother. The room felt too private, too sacred, and yet this secret taught him something important, that even silence has layers, and even emptiness is not entirely empty. He began to listen differently, to the sigh of doors, the murmur of wind through the rafters, the rhythm of his own breath against stillness. Every sound he thought carried a shadow, and in the shadow lived something like memory, something like love. One night before sleep, he whispered to the room, "Thank you." And in the faintest breath, like a lullaby curling back to him, the room replied, "You." It was enough. He drifted into sleep, believing that the world itself could hear him, and that somewhere, in its quiet heart, it was already answering. He first noticed it in a dream. The hallway of his childhood home stretched, longer than it ever had in waking life, its wallpaper breathing softly, as if the house itself were alive. Shadows drifted across the floor like passing clouds, and at the very end, where in daylight there was only a wall, stood a door that had never been there before. It wasn't a grand door, not gilded or carved. It was plain wood, pale as driftwood, its frame glowing faintly, as though it remembered a light long extinguished. He stood before it, hesitant. His small hand reached out, brushing the smooth surface. The wood was warm, like a palm pressed against his own. He turned the handle and stepped through. On the other side was not another room, but a space that felt unmoored from the house and from time. The floor was soft like moss, though no ground could be seen. It was as if he stood upon a dream itself. Around him floated objects, familiar yet altered. His childhood toys, his blanket folded neatly, a small teacup that had belonged to his grandmother. They hovered in the air, swaying gently, as though resting in a quiet tide. At the center of the space a chair waited. Old, wooden, humble. And on the chair sat no one. Yet when he approached, he felt the weight of presence. A kindness, invisible, but near. He climbed onto the chair, his legs dangling, and listened. For though the room was still, he could hear whispers, soft as a lullaby sung from another room. He didn't know the words, but he knew they were meant for him. Night after night the door returned, not always in the same place, not always the same size, but always waiting. Sometimes it appeared behind the wardrobe, sometimes in the corner of the attic, sometimes in the simple space between two blinks. And each time he entered, the room beyond had changed, holding small fragments of memory. The sound of rain on the tin roof, the scent of fresh bread, the faint echo of laughter from a day already past. It was not a place of answers. It was a place of remembering. He learned slowly that the secret door only appeared when he carried quiet inside him. On nights of noise, when anger filled his chest, or when sadness spilled into tears, the hallway stretched, but no door came. Only, when he stilled, when he softened, did it return. It seemed to teach him something without words, that stillness opens paths that rushing cannot. One evening, while sitting in the moss-soft room, he noticed a single lantern flickering in the air. It swayed toward him as though curious, its flame, gentle, never burning. He cupped it in his hands and the light hummed a memory. Suddenly he was standing again in his mother's kitchen, small, sleepy, watching her hum to herself as she kneaded dough. The lantern's glow pulsed like her voice, steady and warm. When the vision faded, he found himself weeping, not from sorrow, but from the fragile sweetness of remembering something ordinary that had almost been lost. The door had given him this gift. He began to trust it, even to love it, not as one loves a toy or a friend, but as one loves the wind through trees, something that asks nothing yet shapes everything. Sometimes he wondered, who had built the door? Was it his imagination? Or did others have such doors too, waiting for them in secret corners of their dreams? He would never know. But he carried the possibility like a secret pebble in his pocket, a quiet comfort when the world felt too heavy. One night, after a long day of loneliness, he asked the door aloud, "Will you stay with me forever?" The mossy room gave no reply, yet the lanterns swayed gently as though nodding, and in that moment silence felt like the most truthful answer of all. Years later, when he was older, he would look back and realize the first secret door had been the beginning of everything, the first whisper that the world was wider than walls, deeper than clocks, softer than what most eyes could see. But for now, as a child, he simply sat in the chair, swinging his legs, and let the whispers of the hidden room carry him toward sleep. The clock had always been there. It stood in the hallway of his grandmother's house, tall and solemn, its wood polished so many times it gleamed even in shadow. Its pendulum swung with a patient rhythm, a steady heartbeat that seemed older than the house itself. To the boy, it was less a machine and more a guardian, something that watched quietly, keeping count of moments when no one else did. Yet one evening the clock began to change. It was subtle at first. The hands slowed, dragging across the numbers as if tired. The tick of the pendulum stretched longer, its rhythm unsteady, almost like a sigh. Then, without warning, it simply stopped. The boy waited for the chime that usually marked the hour, but none came. The silence felt heavy, like a room holding its breath. When he pressed his small ear to the wooden case, he expected to hear gears, grinding. Instead, he heard something stranger, a low hum, soft and melodic, as though the clock was singing to itself. Night after night, the clock remained frozen, its hands pointing nowhere in particular. At first he thought it was broken, but then he noticed something curious. When he stood in front of the clock, time seemed to lose its grip. A minute could stretch into hours, or hours could collapse into what felt like seconds. Sometimes he would blink, and the sun had already set. Other times he would sit in front of it for what felt like whole afternoons, only to find that no time at all had passed. The clock wasn't broken. The clock had simply decided to let go. At first, this unsettled him. Without its ticking, he didn't know when to eat or when to sleep. The rhythm of life blurred. But slowly, he began to notice a gentler pattern, the rise and fall of his own breath, the way shadows lengthened and retreated, the calls of birds in morning and their silence at night. He realized that time lived everywhere, not just inside a clock. One afternoon, as he sat before it, he whispered, "Why did you stop?" The silence stretched, and then the pendulum moved, not in a swing, but in a single, deliberate bow, as if acknowledging his question. It was the closest thing to an answer he would ever get. He started to treat the clock as a teacher. It showed him patience. When he grew restless, he would sit with it, breathing with the stillness until restlessness melted away. It showed him presence. Without numbers pushing him forward, he learned to notice details, the way light flickered through curtains, the sound of leaves tapping against the window, the slow settling of dust. Most of all, it taught him that waiting could be gentle. 1. Night. He dreamed of the clock. In the dream, its face glowed faintly, and its hands drifted free, floating like feathers. He stepped closer and saw that behind the numbers, instead of gears, there was a sky full of stars. The pendulum swung across them like a slow comet, and when he placed his hand against the glass, he felt no ticking, only his own heartbeat, steady and soft, as if the clock had merged with him. When he awoke, he carried that feeling like a secret. He no longer needed the hands to move. He no longer feared stillness. The clock had become more than an object. It was a mirror of patience, teaching him that not everything needs to be measured, that some things, love, memory, wonder, exist outside of ours. Years later, when the house grew quieter and he grew taller, Visitors would sometimes complain about the clock. "Why doesn't it work?" they asked. He would smile softly and say, "It works in its own way." And though they never understood, he felt no need to explain further. For in that still, silent guardian, he had learned a truth that most would never notice. Sometimes the most important moments in life are the ones that slip free of time altogether. That night, as he drifted toward sleep, he imagined the pendulum still bowing, slow and reverent, swinging not between seconds but between heartbeats. And in that rhythmless rhythm, he found peace. It was a faded quilt, patched so many times its colors had softened into a quiet tapestry of blues and grays. Frayed threads curled along the edges like tiny rivers, and some squares had worn thin, almost translucent when the moonlight touched them. But to the boy it was alive, woven not only of fabric but of memory. Every night, as he pulled it across his shoulders, he felt something stir beneath its stitches. The blanket seemed to hum, with a warmth that went deeper than comfort. It carried a weight that was not heavy, but ancient, as though hundreds of nights, hundreds of dreams had seeped into its threads and stayed there, waiting. The first time he noticed, he was half asleep. His hand brushed a patch of pale fabric near the corner, and suddenly a picture flickered in his mind. A meadow he had never seen, filled with tall grass swaying under golden light. The vision lasted only a moment, but it was clear, more vivid than an ordinary dream. When he touched another patch, he saw a different memory, not his own, but someone else's. A pair of hands kneading dough, a child laughing as they chased fireflies, an old man sitting by a fire humming a song with no words. The blanket, he realized, remembered. Every dream that had ever passed through it lingered there like dew on grass, soft and fleeting, but never gone. Each patch held a fragment of a life, a whisper of a night, and when he was quiet enough, open enough, the blanket shared them with him. At first, this frightened him. The dreams didn't belong to him. What right did he have to hold them? But soon the fear softened into awe. The dreams were gentle, never sharp or frightening. They carried a tenderness that reminded him that everyone, everywhere, longed for warmth when they closed their eyes. The boy began to treat the blanket like a map. Before sleep, he would trace his fingers along the quilt, wondering what dream would rise to meet him. Sometimes he was given visions of places he might never visit, a boat gliding across glassy water, a tower wrapped in ivy, a lantern swaying above a quiet street. Other times he felt the emotions of strangers, grief like rain, joy like sudden sunlight, longing like a soft, unspoken prayer. The dreams didn't always make sense, but they left him with something he couldn't quite name, a closeness to people he had never met. He began to notice that the blanket shaped his own dreams too. Nights wrapped in it carried a gentler rhythm, a slower unfolding, as if he were being guided. Once he dreamed of sitting in a vast hall filled with doors, each one glowing faintly. A voice whispered, "Every dream you see is a doorway left, opened by another soul. Step carefully and you will learn to listen." When he awoke, the blanket was heavy on his chest, as though holding him in place, reminding him not to rush into morning too quickly. The boy also learned that the blanket could soothe his restlessness. On nights when fear pressed against him, the fear of growing, of losing, of change, he pulled the quilt close, and the dreams it carried seemed to whisper back, "Others have felt this too. You are not alone." The knowledge was enough to quiet the storms. Years later, when his grandmother told him the blanket had been in the family for generations, he wasn't surprised. She said it had been passed down from hand to hand, child to child. No one knew who first stitched it together, only that it had always seemed lucky. He smiled quietly at that word. To him, it wasn't luck. It was memory, woven deep, refusing to fade. One evening, as he wrapped himself in it, he wondered what of his own dreams might be stitched into its fabric. Did the blanket remember the meadow he had seen, the tower wrapped in ivy? Would another child, years from now, touch the same square and glimpse his dreams as clearly as he glimpsed the others? The thought filled him with a tender hope. Perhaps that was what legacy meant, not monuments or grand tales, but a thread of warmth carried quietly through time, keeping the nights gentle for those who came after. In the stillness of that thought, He closed his eyes. The blanket grew heavier, but in the way comfort does, not burden. As he drifted, he thought he heard it sigh, not with weariness, but with the patience of something that has held countless nights and will hold countless more. And in that sigh, in that hush of woven memory, the boy slipped easily into dreams. Not only his own, but the dreams of many stitched together into a tapestry of quiet belonging. The first time he saw her, she was standing by the edge of the river, tossing pebbles into the slow, rippling current. The light was dim, neither morning nor evening, as if the sky itself couldn't decide which side of time to lean toward. And yet, something about her presence felt older than the day, older even than the water that had been flowing long before. Neither of them was born. He didn't know her name, he didn't know why she was there. But as soon as she turned and their eyes met, something inside him loosened, as if a knot he hadn't realized he carried had quietly unraveled. She was a stranger, yes, but the kind of stranger who carried the warmth of recognition, the feeling you get when you walk into a room you've never seen and still know where the doorways lead. She smiled at him, small and unassuming, the kind of smile that asked nothing and offered everything. "Do you hear it?" she asked. "Hear what?" he replied, uncertain. "The river," she said. "It speaks differently when someone's watching, softer, almost shy." He tilted his head and listened. At first all he heard was the gentle lapping of water against stone. But then, as he let himself fall into the sound, he noticed it had a rhythm, like the whisper of a lullaby repeating endlessly without needing to change. And somehow he believed her. From that moment on, he felt less alone. The stranger began to appear in places where he wandered. Not often enough to seem like she was following him, but just enough that he began to expect it. By the old willow tree whose branches bent into the shape of hands, by the lantern bridge that swayed slightly in the wind, by the meadow that bloomed, too quickly in spring, as if eager to make up for lost time. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. It never seemed to matter. She had a way of filling silence with presence, so that even when no words passed between them, the space felt alive, not empty. He began to notice small details about her, the way her hair caught starlight like strands of silver thread, the way her laughter carried a softness that never pressed too hard against the air, the way she sometimes paused as if listening to something only she could hear. And though she remained a stranger, every moment with her deepened the feeling that they had already shared something long before their first meeting. One evening, as they sat side by side beneath a sky scattered with restless clouds, she asked him, "Do you ever feel like you've known someone before you actually met them?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, with you." She didn't look surprised. Instead, she smiled that small smile again and said, "Good, then it isn't just me." The boy, though he was growing older now, taller, his voice steadier, didn't know what to make of it. Was it fate? Was it chance? Or was it simply the way certain souls recognized each other, like lanterns finding their reflections in the water? Whatever it was, he found himself carrying her presence even when she wasn't there. Her words echoed in his thoughts, not loudly, but like the faint sound of a bell carried from far away. He began to trust the silences between them. And by trusting those silences, he began to trust the silences within himself. One night, under a sky that hummed with unseen stars, she said something he would never forget. "People think we only meet in one lifetime," she whispered. "But sometimes I think we meet again and again, wearing different faces, finding different rivers. Maybe that's why we feel familiar. Because this isn't the first time." Her words sank into him, like stones into the riverbed, quietly, steadily, without splash. He didn't know if it was true, but he wanted it to be. As the seasons shifted, their meetings became less frequent, as though life itself was pulling them onto separate paths. But the bond remained. Each time he saw her, even after long stretches of absence, it was as though no time had passed at all. She was still the stranger who wasn't truly a stranger, and though he never learned her full story, where she came from, where she went when she wasn't with him, he realized it didn't matter. What mattered was the way she made the world feel less sharp, less uncertain. What mattered was the way her presence taught him something his childhood had only begun to whisper, that some connections defy explanation. That some people arrive not to stay forever, but to remind us of the timelessness already inside us. When he lay in bed at night, wrapped in the dream-stitched blanket of his youth, he thought of her, and he wondered if his dreams brushed against hers. And though he had no answer, the thought itself was enough to lull him into rest. The stranger, the river, the silence, they became part of him, etched quietly into the map of his growing years, and somewhere deep down, he understood. The most familiar faces are sometimes the ones we are still learning to see. He found the library by accident, or perhaps it found him. It was tucked between two crooked streets, where the cobblestones seemed to bend inward as if hiding a secret. The building itself was quiet, unremarkable at first glance, with ivy climbing its walls and windows fogged with the breath of ages. And yet, the moment he stepped inside, he felt something shift, like the hush before snowfall, or the pause between heartbeats. The library was vast, but not in a way that could be measured. Its shelves seemed to stretch beyond sight, spiraling into shadow and glow. Books filled every corner, but they were not like ordinary books. They whispered. They moved. Sometimes a page turned without a hand, as though the story inside was restless, to be read. Sometimes the air carried the faint rustle of footsteps, though no one walked the aisles. At first he thought he was alone, but as he wandered deeper, the silence grew companion-like, wrapping around him as though it knew he belonged there. He ran his fingers across the spines of books that hummed faintly, like a pulse beneath their covers. Each title glimmered differently, depending on the angle of light, shifting words he couldn't always recognize. When he pulled one down, it opened on its own. The pages fluttered until they landed on a memory, not his, but someone else's. He saw a child standing on a hill of golden grass, waiting for a parent who never returned. He felt the ache of longing, the way silence grew heavy when hope dimmed. And then, before the sadness became too heavy, the pages turned again, showing laughter, a family sharing bread, warmth spilling across their faces like candlelight. The boy, no longer so little now, closed the book gently, his heart still tingling with the remnants of emotions that were not his own. He realized then what the library was, not a collection of stories, but a collection of lives. Footsteps left behind, gathered and bound in paper. Each shelf held the soft traces of people long gone, their joys and sorrows preserved in ink. As he walked, the floor beneath him echoed faintly. His own steps joined the chorus of those who had walked there before, quiet footsteps, reverent and slow, becoming part of the library's memory. He met a librarian, though not in the usual sense. She appeared like a shadow softened by candlelight, her presence more felt than seen. She spoke little, but her eyes carried the weight of centuries. When she gestured to a book, he knew he was meant to open it. Inside, he saw fragments of himself, his childhood blanket that remembered dreams, the secret door that had appeared in sleep, the night the sky whispered his name. Somehow even his own story had a place here, as though the library had been watching, recording, holding. "Why me?" he asked softly. The librarian only smiled, placing one finger gently against her lips, a gesture of silence, of reverence. He stayed for hours, maybe days. Time felt blurred, as though the clock that forgot hours had extended its lesson into this place. He read pieces of lives he would never live, learned tenderness from strangers he would never meet. He wept quietly, at losses that were not his own, and felt joy at moments he hadn't experienced. In that, he understood something profound. Every story was a thread, and together they wove the fabric of what it meant to be alive. When at last he left the library, he carried no book in his hands. The shelves kept their secrets, but his steps felt different now, softer, steadier. He understood that every step he took was already becoming a story, one that might someday echo quietly on the shelves for another wanderer to find. And as the doors closed gently behind him, he heard the faintest sound, like footsteps trailing just behind him, too soft to belong to anyone but memory. The first raindrop touched his cheek like a fingertip. It had been weeks since the sky had spoken, clear, dry days where silence stretched across the horizon. But that afternoon, Clouds gathered like old. Friends above him, and before he could even prepare, the rain began to fall. Not in heavy sheets, not in a storm, but in a slow, steady rhythm, as if the world itself was humming. He stood there, unafraid of getting wet, letting the drops run down his skin, soaking into his clothes. And as the rain fell, he noticed something strange. Every drop seemed to carry a different memory. The first drop brought laughter, bright, ringing, the echo of a child chasing fireflies in a meadow. The second carried sorrow, soft, aching. "I hate you," goodbye whispered at a train station, hands lingering before parting. The third was quieter, filled with warmth, the steady presence of someone humming while baking bread. He tilted his face upward, closing his eyes, and the rain spoke to him. In fragments. With every drop, he felt pieces of lives he had never lived, yet somehow understood. Some were fleeting, the feeling of grass under bare feet, the rush of diving into a cool river. Others lingered, the weight of waiting for news, the comfort of being held when words failed. He realized then that the rain was not just water, it was memory. The world remembered, and when it overflowed, it shared those memories with whoever was willing to listen. Walking through the drizzle, he began to notice how the earth responded. Flowers lifted their heads, catching droplets as though they were drinking in forgotten stories. Trees bent slightly, their leaves trembling in recognition. Even the stones seemed darker, heavier, as though remembering something deep within. A stranger passed him on the path, an old man with eyes like storm clouds. He smiled knowingly, nodding toward the rain. "You're listening?" the man said. "Most just try to stay dry." The boy, no longer quite a boy, hesitated, then asked, "What does it mean?" The old man chuckled softly, rain dripping from his beard. "It means the world still speaks if we let it. Every drop has traveled farther than we can imagine. Oceans, rivers, skies. Each one has carried a story, waiting to fall into someone's hands. Together, they walk. They walked beneath the rain. The man taught him how to hold still and hear beyond the sound, to listen not only with ears but with heart. When he tried, he felt the rhythm shift. The rain was not random but patterned, like a lullaby only the earth could sing. Sometimes it was gentle, soothing like a mother's hand, sometimes sharp, striking like moments of pain, but always it carried something worth remembering. When the stranger parted ways, he left behind no name, only a final piece of wisdom. Don't forget what the rain tells you. It's not just water, it's the voice of everything that came before. That night, as the rain tapped gently against the roof where he slept, he felt its presence in his dreams. Drops became words, words became whispers, whispers became visions. He saw children dancing in puddles, lovers sheltering beneath a single umbrella, wanderers walking alone yet never truly lonely. And when he woke, the rain had stopped, but the lesson lingered. He understood that memories are not just inside us. They fall, they flow, they return. They are shared across the world like rain, touching one life and then another. From then on, whenever the clouds gathered, he no longer sought shelter. Instead, he welcomed the rain, letting it fall across his skin like a teacher's hand. Each drop reminded him that he was part of something vast and continuous, an endless cycle of memory, kindness, and renewal. And sometimes, when the drops slid across his palms, he swore he could almost catch one and keep it forever. A story, a life, held in the hollow of his hand. The river was dark that evening, its surface glimmering only in fragments of the moon. He had walked many paths in his wandering, but when he came upon the wooden bridge stretching across the water, he paused. It wasn't the bridge itself that stopped him, it was the lights, lanterns, hundreds of them swaying gently in the night air. Each hung along the rails like little suns, glowing with warmth that felt both alive and ancient. Some were bright and golden, others dim and flickering, but each carried a presence as though something or someone lived inside. He stepped onto the bridge, the wood creaking softly beneath his feet. As he moved closer to the lanterns, he noticed something strange. Each one pulsed faintly whenever he drew near, as though recognizing him. And with that pulse came a sensation, memories but not his own. The first lantern glowed warmly, and he felt the quiet kindness of a baker who had given bread to a hungry child without asking for payment. The second shivered with softer light, carrying the memory of a daughter braiding her mother's hair, her hands trembling with care. The third flickered brightly, revealing the small courage of a boy who had stood up for a stranger in the marketplace, though his voice shook with fear. He understood then. Each lantern held an act of kindness, not grand deeds or heroic rescues, but small moments that shaped the quiet goodness of the world. As he walked farther, he realized that the bridge was not just a crossing, it was a keeper of compassion. Every light, a memory, every glow, a kindness, a never forgotten. He stopped before one lantern that shone with unusual brightness. When he touched it gently, warmth spread through his chest. A memory bloomed, an old woman who used to hum lullabies while sewing clothes for children who had none. Her voice was soft, her hands tired, but her love endless. Tears rose unbidden, though he couldn't explain why. Perhaps because he felt the weight of her care, or perhaps because kindness, when remembered, always carried a sweetness touched with sadness. Halfway across, he sat at the edge of the bridge, letting the lanterns sway around him. The river below reflected their glow, so it seemed as though stars had fallen into the water. He listened to the wind pushing softly through the flames and realized that kindness, too, had a voice. It whispered in the flicker of fire, in the warmth of light, in the hush of night. For a long while he simply breathed, letting the lanterns speak to him. Some told stories of strangers who became friends, others of small sacrifices no one ever saw, but which mattered all the same. Each lantern reminded him of how every gesture, no matter how small, carried forward like ripples in a river. When he finally reached the end of the bridge, he saw one last lantern set apart from the others. Its flame was dim, as though nearly gone. He cupped it gently in his hands, shielding it from the wind. As he did, he felt the memory inside, an act of kindness that had been forgotten by almost everyone. A boy had once left an apple on a teacher's desk, shyly, without a word. The teacher, tired and heavy-hearted, had smiled for the first time in weeks because of it. That simple gift had carried her through a long, difficult season, yet no one remembered, not even the boy, perhaps, and yet the bridge remembered. He stood there in the silence, holding the lantern, until its flame steadied. Then he placed it carefully back where it belonged, its glow brighter now than before. As he stepped off the bridge, he looked back once more. The lanterns swayed, their lights dancing like gentle souls. He knew he would carry them within him, that every kindness, even the smallest, was not lost. It lived on somewhere, glowing quietly in the dark. The village he came upon smelled of rain and wood smoke, but above all it smelled of bread. It drifted through the crooked streets like a lullaby, soft, warm, unassuming. The scent followed him even as the evening deepened, as though guiding his steps toward something important. At the center of the village stood a small stone bakery, its windows glowing like fireflies against the dark. He pushed the wooden door open, and a tiny bell chimed. Though its sound was so faint it seemed more like a whisper than a ring. Inside, the warmth was immediate, wrapping him in comfort. Loaves of bread rested on the shelves, round, golden, cracked in places where the crust had split, releasing hidden fragrance. Behind the counter stood an old baker, his hands dusted with flour, his eyes soft as he shaped dough upon the table. The baker looked up and smiled, as though he had been expecting him. "Travelers always find their way here," he said gently. "Not for food, but for memory." Confused, he stepped closer, watching the man knead. With each fold of the dough, a rhythm emerged. Press, fold, stretch, rest. The sound was not loud, but it was steady, like the heartbeat of the room itself. And then he heard it, a song, not sung by voice, but carried in the rhythm of the kneading, in the sigh of the oven, in the crackle of the crust as bread cooled on wooden boards. It was a song of care, of patience, of love, baked quietly into something ordinary. He closed his eyes and listened. The melody reminded him of mornings long ago, when he had woken to the smell of bread at home. A blanket wrapped around him, sunlight spilling through curtains. He remembered small hands breaking a loaf, sharing without hesitation. He remembered the comfort of being fed, not just with food but with love disguised as something simple. The baker placed a fresh loaf in his hands. "Taste," he said. He tore a piece from the warm bread and brought it to his mouth. The flavor was rich but not extravagant. It was humble, earthy, alive, and within it, he tasted the song. Every bite carried a memory, though not always his own. He tasted the laughter of children racing home with warm loaves under their arms. He tasted the quiet relief of a mother feeding her family after a long day. He tasted the gratitude of strangers who had once been handed bread freely, without question. Tears pricked his eyes, though he could not explain why. Perhaps because bread was so ordinary that people forgot it held meaning. And yet, in its plainness, it carried a secret music, one that reminded him of everything tender, everything necessary. He sat at the small wooden table by the window as the baker continued his work. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the glass in soft percussion. Together, the rain and the kneading formed a duet, weaving a lullaby that filled the room. The baker spoke again, though his voice was quiet, as if afraid to disturb the song. "People think bread is only to fill the stomach, but it also fills the heart. It reminds us that survival alone is not enough. We need warmth, we need sharing, we need songs hidden in simple things." He nodded, holding the loaf close as though it were more than food. In that moment he understood. Kindness could take the shape of many things: a lantern on a bridge, a lullaby whispered in the dark, or even a loaf of bread, baked with care. When he left the bakery, the night air was cool, the streets wet with rain. He carried the loaf with him not because he was hungry, but because he felt its quiet song beating against his palm. Each step seemed lighter, steadier, as though the bread itself carried him forward. And as he walked, he hummed, not a tune he knew, but one the bread had given him. A song hidden in something ordinary, now alive within him. The night stretched, wide and endless, the kind of night where silence seemed to hum with hidden meaning. He walked along a narrow path that wound through fields of tall grass, their silver tips bending in the breeze like ripples across a dark sea. The world felt hushed, almost expectant, as though something gentle waited for him beyond the horizon. And then he noticed it. The moon, not simply hanging high in the sky, distant and untouchable, but low and close, as if it had drawn nearer just for him. Its glow softened the fields, painted the blades of grass in quiet silver, and laid a pale ribbon across the path ahead. He stopped walking. The stillness felt sacred, and then, like a friend slipping quietly into place beside him, the moon seemed to settle at his side, not as a presence above, but as a companion, keeping pace with his steps. He did not speak, and the moon did not answer. There were no words, but he felt it, the comfort of being accompanied, of not being alone in his wandering. For a time they simply walked together. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain and wildflowers. The moon's light brushed gently across his face, as though in reassurance. Each time his thoughts grew heavy, memories of mistakes, of words left unsaid, of moments he wished he could return to, the moon's presence softened them, reminding him that even shadows were part of the night. When he grew tired, he sat upon a stone at the edge of the path. The moon rested above him like a lantern hung by some invisible hand. Its glow touched the earth in a perfect circle, as though creating a space meant only for him. He whispered then, though he wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was easier to speak to the moon than to people. "I'm not sure where I'm going." The moon said nothing, but its silence was not empty. It was full of listening, so he kept speaking. He spoke of his wandering, of the secret door he had once dreamed of the bread that carried songs, of the faces he carried with him in memory. His words came slow, halting, but they spilled out as though the night itself had been waiting to hold them. And when he was done, the moon simply shone steadily, gently, without judgment. It did not give answers, nor did it demand them. It only offered its quiet companionship, reminding him that being understood was not always about words. Sometimes it was about presence. He lay back upon the grass, staring up at the glowing circle. Above, the stars glittered faintly around it, but none outshone its soft light. He felt a peace settle over him. the kind of peace that came not from resolution but from acceptance, that perhaps it was enough to simply walk, to simply feel, to simply be. As his eyes grew heavy, he thought he felt the moon lean closer, brushing, its cool glow against his forehead like a mother's hand, smoothing hair before sleep. And just before he drifted into dreams, he heard it, not in words, but in feeling. You are not lost. You are walking beneath the same sky as everyone before. You keep going. I will sit beside you as long as you need. He smiled faintly in the dark. And with that, he slept beneath the silver light, wrapped in the quiet companionship of the moon. The path narrowed as he entered the forest, where the trees grew tall and close, their trunks etched with the slow wisdom of centuries. The canopy. Above wove itself into a roof of green and shadow, letting only slivers of light fall to the earth like threads of silver. Every step he took was softened by fallen leaves, muffling his presence as though the forest preferred quiet. But then he noticed something unusual. Each time he paused, the forest seemed to lean toward him. The branches bent ever so slightly. The leaves rustled though there was no wind, and the air thickened, expectant, as if the trees themselves were listening. He whispered, testing the silence. "Can you hear me?" The forest responded not with words but with movement, the shiver of branches, the sigh of leaves. It felt like a nod, like an ancient acknowledgement that did not need sound. So he began to speak. At first his voice was hesitant. He told the trees of the night the sky had spoken, of the secret door that appeared only in dreams, of the clock that forgot time. He spoke of the moon who had once walked beside him in silence. Each story carried pieces of his heart, fragments he had been holding quietly for too long, and the forest listened. Every word seemed to sink into the bark, into the roots, into the soil itself. The trees creaked softly, as if shifting to make room for his memories. A bird somewhere in the distance sang a single note, long and clear before falling silent again, as though adding its agreement to the story. Encouraged, he spoke more freely. He confessed his fears, of being forgotten, of not knowing where his path would lead, of the strange loneliness that even the moon's light could not always soften. The trees swayed together, their branches brushing one another like hands reaching for comfort. One tree in particular stood before him, its bark scarred and weathered. He pressed his palm against it, feeling the cool roughness beneath his skin. To his surprise, he felt warmth pulse faintly through it, like a heartbeat buried. "Deep within the trunk, I feel as though I've been carrying too much," he whispered, "and I don't know how to set it down." The forest stirred. Leaves tumbled down around him, gentle and golden, as if the trees themselves were shedding something on his behalf. One leaf landed against his chest, and for a moment he imagined it carrying away some of the heaviness lodged inside him. A quiet realization grew within him. The forest did not try to solve his troubles. It did not offer answers or directions. Instead, it listened, truly listened, and in its patient silence he felt lighter. He sat among the roots, closing his eyes. The air was filled with the scent of moss, damp wood, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers hidden somewhere in the undergrowth. The world outside felt distant, blurred. Here time slowed until it nearly stopped. In that stillness he heard something, faint, almost impossible to notice at first. A soft hum, not unlike the lullabies he had once heard in the room of echoes. But now the hum came from the earth itself, from the roots stretching deep below him. It was the sound of belonging. He realized then that even silence could hold music, and even stillness could speak. The forest reminded him that being heard did not always mean receiving words in return. Sometimes it meant finding a place where your soul could rest, knowing it was held. When he finally rose, the trees parted slightly, creating a wider path forward. It felt like permission, as though the forest had listened long enough and now gently urged him onward. He touched the bark of the nearest tree one last time, whispering his thanks, and as he stepped beyond the canopy, he carried with him not just his own thoughts but the patient silence of the forest, the memory of what it felt like to be deeply, quietly heard. The mirror did not look extraordinary at first. It was small, oval-shaped, framed in tarnished silver that carried the quiet wear of years. He discovered it in a dim corridor of a house that seemed older than memory itself, its floorboards sighing beneath his steps. Dust had gathered across the surface, muting its shine, yet something about it caught his attention, not with a shout, but with a whisper, the kind that slips beneath your skin before you realize it. He brushed the surface clean with his sleeve, and the glass flickered. At first it showed only him, his tired eyes, his travel-worn clothes, the soft line of uncertainty carved into his brow. But then the reflection changed, not into someone else but into a gentler version of himself. The shadows beneath his eyes softened. The tension in his jaw melted away. His expression was the same, but calmer, kinder, almost as if the mirror reflected not who he was, but how he longed to feel. He stared, hardly breathing. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped aside, allowing others in his memory to appear. The first was his mother. The mirror revealed her face not as he remembered in her final years, but as she had once been, radiant with youth, laughter caught in her eyes. He saw the way her features softened, not with age but with tenderness, and he realized the mirror showed not the face she carried, but the one she carried in her heart. When he touched the glass, the image rippled like water, as if inviting him deeper into understanding. More faces appeared. A friend who had once drifted away, shown here, not distant, but smiling as though they had never parted. A stranger he had passed in a marketplace, now reflected with warmth he had never noticed. In that fleeting moment, each reflection softened the edges, showing not flaws, not judgments, but a kind of mercy. The boy whispered almost to himself, "Is this who people wish to be?" The mirror gave no answer. It simply shimmered, holding the truth quietly. He lingered mesmerized as the mirror continued to reveal layers of gentleness. Some faces he knew well, others only in passing, yet all of them appeared softened, lightened, as if their hidden kindness had been drawn to the surface. He thought of how often people walked through life unseen, burdened by misunderstandings, or the sharpness of others' eyes, and here for once he could see them as they longed to be seen. His own reflection returned again. But this time, it was different. He was smiling, not the polite curve he often gave others, but the smile he rarely let anyone witness, the one that belonged only to his quietest joys. His reflection reminded him of the boy he once had been, the child who listened to walls, humming lullabies and doors opening only in dreams. It startled him, not because it was strange, but because it was true. He had forgotten what that smile felt like. The mirror taught him something in that silence, to look beyond what was worn, to see not the weariness or scars, but the softness that lay beneath. Perhaps everyone carried a gentler face, one that the world did not always notice, but one that deserved to be remembered. The thought filled him with both ache and peace. Ache because he wished he could show this truth to everyone he loved. Peace because he now knew it lived within them regardless. He stepped back, bowing his head in gratitude, as though the mirror were a teacher rather than an object. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with something he couldn't name. When he turned to leave, the silver frame gleamed faintly, like the last flicker of a candle, and though he walked away, he carried the lesson in his chest, that sometimes what we need most is not to change ourselves, but to be seen in the gentleness we already hold. He first noticed her presence in the quiet spaces, those pauses between thought and breath, between a question and its answer. She did not arrive with noise, nor with the urgency of someone demanding to be heard. She simply was. Like the hush of twilight when the last bird song lingers in the air, her silence was not emptiness. It was fullness, the kind of silence that listens, the kind that steadies. At first he wondered if it was loneliness that drew her near. But no. Loneliness clamors. Her presence rested. They would walk together without words, their steps falling, in rhythm as though time itself bent gently to their pace. She never asked where they were going. She never hurried him forward. When he stopped, she stopped. When he turned to look at the sky, she tilted her head and looked too, her eyes carrying a reflection of his wonder. He once tested the silence. He whispered fragments of his thoughts, half-formed sentences, quiet worries, memories that carried. Wait! She did not interrupt. She did not advise. She simply listened. And in that listening he felt something rare, the sense of being fully received, without condition, without expectation. The boy had known many voices, some that filled the air with laughter, some that carried instruction, some that questioned endlessly. But her silence felt like the softest answer of all. There was a night when the rain whispered against the earth in a steady rhythm, and he sat beneath the eaves of an old wooden house. She sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. They watched. As drops painted dark circles into the soil, hours passed, yet it felt like only moments. He turned to her and said softly, "You remind me of a lullaby without words." She smiled. A small, knowing smile, like the kind that belongs to someone who doesn't need to speak in order to be understood. In her silence, he began to notice things he had overlooked before. The way the wind carried scents of far-off blossoms. The way shadows deepened into shapes that seemed alive. The way his own breath softened when he allowed himself to rest. Her companionship tuned him, like an instrument gently adjusted until it hummed in harmony. There was a story he once read about how some people are like rivers. They carve landscapes not by force, but by steady presence. He thought of that as he sat beside her. She was a river without words, and somehow she carried him forward without his noticing. In time, he realized something extraordinary. Her silence was not absence. It was love. A love that spoke not through promises, but through stillness. A love that did not need to explain itself because it was already there, complete. When he laughed, her eyes glimmered, catching light like a lantern. When he grieved, she did not try to erase his sorrow. She simply stayed, her silence forming a shelter around his fragile heart. In her company, he discovered that some bonds are not built on conversations, but on the spaces between them. One evening, beneath a sky painted with soft clouds, he whispered, "I don't always understand the world, but with you, I don't need to." Her hand brushed against his, not holding, not grasping, just resting beside his as if to remind him. She was there, always there, and in that simple truth, he learned what many spend their whole lives searching for, that love can live in silence. That devotion can hum beneath the quiet, steady, and eternal. When he finally rose to leave, she did not follow. She stayed where she was, her silence as soft as the twilight itself. But as he walked away, he felt her presence within him, like a quiet flame that would never be extinguished. She did not need to speak to tell him what mattered. He already knew. He arrived at the town just as the horizon began to dim, that in-between hour when shadows lengthen and lanterns are usually lit. Yet here, no lamps flickered, no doors opened, no footsteps echoed. The air carried a hush so complete, it felt as if even time had folded itself into slumber. The streets were lined with houses, beautiful in their stillness but strangely haunting. Windows reflected only the fading sky, unmoved by life within. Doors stood closed, not locked, but resting, as though waiting for something that would never come. And everywhere he turned, silence. At first, he thought he was alone. But then he noticed them, figures asleep in gentle postures. A woman with her head resting against a windowsill, her hair lit faintly by the evening's last gold. A child curled with a toy in their arms, the faintest smile on their lips. A baker with flour still dusting his apron, asleep at the table as though he had paused mid-thought and drifted off. It wasn't sorrowful, this endless sleep. It felt more like surrender, a town wrapped in one long, unbroken dream. He wandered, carefully not wanting to disturb them, though he realized nothing could. Their breathing was steady, unchanging, each chest rising and falling in a rhythm that belonged more to the earth than to any clock. And as he walked, he began to feel the weight of it, not heavy in the way of grief, but in the way of stillness. Charlotte asked him to stop, to listen. The silence here was different from the silence of his companion. This was not the silence of love, but the silence of rest. A town teaching him the art of pausing. He sat on a bench in the town square, its wood, worn smooth by years of unseen lives. The fountain nearby still flowed, though no one stood to gather water. Its steady trickle seemed louder than usual, the only moving sound. Looking around, he wondered what dreams filled the hearts of these resting souls. Did they wander through skies without end? Did they remember lost loves, replaying tender moments again and again? Or did they dream of nothing at all, simply sinking into the deepest peace? He thought about his own restless nights, about the weight of wandering, the way thoughts sometimes refused to settle. Here, though, he felt an invitation to lay down those restless pieces and let them dissolve into something gentler. In the stillness, memories rose. He thought of childhood nights when sleep had been easy, when his mother's humming voice had been enough to draw him into dreams. He thought of the mornings he had woken early, heart racing with plans, forgetting that the world sometimes asked for softness instead of urgency. The town's lesson whispered without words. Not every day must be filled, not every hour must be measured. There is power in stopping, in letting life breathe without your hands guiding it. He noticed a bookshop on the corner, its door slightly ajar. Inside, dust motes floated like stars caught in still air. Books lay open on tables, their pages paused, mid-story. He touched one gently, finding the words frozen in time as though even the tales themselves had chosen to rest. He closed it softly, almost reverently, and whispered, "Sleep well." Back outside, he lay on the grass at the edge of the square. Above, the stars began to appear one by one, their patient glow undisturbed by the silence below. For a moment, he imagined the town breathing with him, each inhalation a shared rhythm, each exhalation a release. He closed his eyes, and though he did not fall into the same enchanted slumber, he allowed himself a taste of their peace. For the first time in a long while, he did not think of where he had been or where he was going. He simply was. When he finally rose to leave, he looked once more at the town. The faces, the still figures, the quiet streets, they would remain, resting forever, untouched by urgency. He bowed his head slightly as though in respect and whispered, "Thank you." And then, carrying their lesson within him, he stepped beyond the silent gates and back into the world where time moved on. Yet he knew he would carry that stillness with him, like a secret lullaby sung by an entire town. He found the river by accident, though perhaps it had been guiding him all along. The sound came first, a hushed murmuring softer than a whisper, yet steadier than breath. It was not the sound of rushing water, but of voices woven into its current. When he reached the bank, he saw the river glowing faintly in the dusk, as though moonlight had settled within its depths. The surface moved slowly, carrying fragments, shadows of faces, syllables of words, threads of songs half remembered. He knelt beside it and listened, realizing what the river held. Names, thousands of them, maybe more, spoken by voices fading in and out, like memories on the edge of recall. He leaned closer, and one name brushed his ears. It was familiar, though he could not place where he had heard it. Perhaps in childhood, perhaps only in dream. The sound stirred something deep in him, an ache both tender and comforting. The river did not roar. It whispered, and with every passing moment, he felt it reminding him that no one was ever fully gone, not so long as their name still drifted, carried gently in the flow. He walked along the bank, listening. Her father calling softly, a lover's laugh hidden in the current, the voice of a child repeating their own name proudly, as though to remind the world they had existed. He felt tears rise, though not from sorrow. It was a kind of reverence, the kind that comes when you realize you are part of something much larger than yourself. At a bend in the river, he found stones arranged in a careful circle. Upon each one a single word was etched. Some were clear, some so weathered they could hardly be read. He touched one gently, tracing the grooves of the name, and felt the warmth of memory pulse through his fingertips. Whoever this stone had, once belonged to, their story lingered here, alive in the whisper of the water. He wondered what would happen when his own name drifted into this river someday. Would it be spoken softly by someone passing by, a stranger pausing for a breath of connection, or would it glide silently, unseen but not unloved, into the great distance? As he sat by the river, he thought of the people who had shaped his path, the ones still beside him and the ones who had slipped into memory. He thought of the blanket that had remembered his dreams, the silent companion who had walked with him, the town that had taught him stillness. All of them were names written on his heart, etched like those on the stones. The water glimmered, and he realized something. The river did not ask him to hold on forever. It asked only that he listen, even for a moment, so that the names might live again in the air. A fleeting echo was enough. He closed his eyes, breathing in the cool night, and whispered the names he remembered, some old, some new, some belonging to faces that had already grown blurry in his mind. As he spoke them, the river seemed to pause, as though taking his offerings into its current, weaving them gently with the others. It was then he understood. Memory is not about permanence. It is about presence, about honoring what has passed through you, even if only for a short time. The stars reflected in the water now, each one a name of its own. He imagined the river stretching endlessly, carrying voices into the horizon, never rushing, never stopping. A lullaby of remembrance, always soft, always moving forward. Before he left, he dipped his hand into the water. It was cool, almost weightless, yet it left a lingering warmth on his skin. When he pulled his hand back, he thought he heard his own name just faintly, just once, carried in the current. He smiled. Perhaps it was only his imagination, or perhaps the river had known him longer than he realized. Either way, he carried the echo with him as he stepped away, the whispers trailing behind like a blessing. He first noticed it drifting above him on a still morning when the air was too calm for anything to move. A single white feather hung in the sky, suspended as though the world had forgotten the law of gravity. He waited, expecting it to fall, but it never did. Days passed, and still the feather lingered, always hovering just above reach, swaying ever so slightly as though caught in a breeze no one else could feel. Some nights when he lay awake, he would see it glowing faintly in the moonlight as though lit from within. At first he thought it was a trick of his eyes, but then he noticed how others looked past it, never remarking on its presence. It was as if the feather revealed itself only to him, as if it belonged to his story alone. He began to visit it daily, sitting beneath its quiet dance. He would speak softly to it, telling the feather things he could not tell anyone else, his doubts, his hidden hopes, his questions that carried no answers. The feather never answered back, but somehow it listened. Its silence was comforting, like the pause between heartbeats. One evening he brought with him a memory too heavy to hold alone. He whispered it upward, and for the first time the feather shimmered. A ripple of light moved through it, subtle but undeniable. He understood. Then it carried not only stillness but a promise that even the smallest, most fragile thing could endure, refusing to fall when the world expected it to. He thought of the people he had known who had carried impossible burdens with quiet grace, a mother who never let her children see her weariness, a friend who kept smiling even when shadows clung to his steps, a stranger who offered kindness with nothing to spare. They were like this feather, fragile in form yet unbroken in spirit. In time he realized the feather was not simply floating, it was teaching. Its defiance against gravity was not loud or proud, it was gentle, patient, unwavering. It asked nothing of him but to believe in what endures, even when unseen. He began to notice other small feathers in his life, not literal ones, but moments that felt just as unlikely, just as quietly miraculous. A song remembered from childhood when he needed comfort, a hand on his shoulder at the exact moment he felt alone, a sunrise on a day when he had nearly given up on light. Each one was a feather that never fell, suspended in the fabric of his story. One night he dreamed he reached the feather at last. In his dream he touched it gently, and it was warm, like the palm of a hand. It pulsed faintly, as though alive. When he woke, the feather was still there, unchanged, still floating. But he carried with him the dream, and in that dream he felt what the feather had meant all along. Hope is not about soaring, it is about staying, about refusing to vanish, no matter how fragile the thread. And so he let the feather be. He stopped, trying to reach it, stopped waiting for it to fall. Instead, he simply carried it with him in his heart, knowing it would always hover above him as a quiet reminder that even the smallest thing can defy the heaviness of the world. The seasons changed, and still the feather lingered. Perhaps it would remain there forever, or perhaps one day it would vanish when he no longer needed it. He understood now that it did not matter. What mattered was what it had taught him. Some things survive not because they are strong, but because they are gentle, and sometimes gentleness is the strongest force of all. He found the garden by accident, though perhaps it had always been waiting for him. A narrow path wound between tall grasses, leading to a gate of rusted iron. It looked ordinary enough, yet the air around it hummed with something soft and familiar, like the memory of a song half forgotten. When he stepped through the gate, the world shifted. Flowers bloomed in colors he could not name. Hues that felt less like pigments and more like emotions turned visible. Each blossom swayed gently, releasing a fragrance that was strangely nostalgic, though he could not place why. It did not take him long to understand. These were not ordinary flowers. Each one held the dream of someone who had once dared to imagine something beautiful, but had let it go. A dream of a child who once wanted to fly. A dream of a young woman who wished to sing under moonlight. A dream of an old man who longed to paint, but never found the brush. As he walked deeper, the garden began to stir with whispers. He bent down beside a pale blue bloom and heard laughter, the laughter of his younger self, chasing fireflies under a summer sky. Another flower opened, releasing the scent of freshly baked bread, and he remembered his grandmother's kitchen, her hands dusted with flour. It was overwhelming, yet gentle. The garden did not force him to remember. It simply offered, inviting him to pause beside each flower and choose whether to breathe it in. Some memories brought a smile, others a tear, but all of them carried a sweetness that felt like home. In the center of the garden stood a tree with silver bark and branches that glittered as though dipped in starlight. Its leaves shimmered with shifting shapes, like pages of a storybook turning in the breeze. At its roots, flowers bloomed more brightly than anywhere else, as though the tree gave strength to dreams that had been lost the longest. He touched the bark and felt something stir inside him. For the first time in years, he remembered the dream he had carried as a child, to wander through unknown lands, not seeking treasure or fame, but simply to witness the quiet magic of the world. It was a dream he thought he had outgrown, but here it bloomed again, alive and waiting. He sat beneath the tree and closed his eyes. For hours, or perhaps minutes, for time moved differently here, he let the dreams wash over him. He remembered small wishes he had forgotten, like wanting to learn a song he once heard on the wind, or the desire to build a kite that would fly higher than the rooftops. Some dreams had faded, but here they bloomed again, patient and forgiving. It was then he realized the truth of the garden. No dream ever truly dies. It simply waits, hidden in the soil of memory, until someone is gentle enough to water it. Before leaving, he plucked a single flower, a soft golden bloom that pulsed faintly with light. As he held it, he understood this was his own dream returned. To him, offered not as a command but as a reminder. Dreams are not meant to burden us. They are meant to guide us gently, like lanterns in the dark. When he stepped back through the gate, the garden faded behind him, but the flower remained in his hand, glowing softly. He knew it would stay with him for as long as he tended to it, with care, and somewhere behind that hidden gate, countless other dreams still waited. Dreams of strangers, of friends, of forgotten children, blooming patiently, ready to return to whoever was willing to remember. The path from the garden led him to the sea. It was not the roaring kind of ocean, fierce and untamed, but a vast stretch of quiet waters, rippling gently under the weight of the moon. The air smelled of salt and stillness, and the horizon shimmered like a mirror between worlds. Far ahead, rising from a lonely cliff, he saw a lighthouse. Its tower was tall, worn by time, and crowned with a lantern that glowed not with fire but with something softer, like starlight gathered into a flame. The beam swept slowly across the sea, but instead of warning ships away, it seemed to call them closer. It wasn't light for navigation, it was light for remembering, When he stepped inside, the air was filled with warmth. The stone walls glowed faintly, and the spiral staircase hummed with whispers. Each step upward seemed to pull a memory to the surface, not just from his life, but from lives that had brushed against his own. He saw his mother's hands as she tucked a blanket under his chin. He saw the smile of a friend he had long since lost touch with. He saw a stranger on a train, someone he never spoke to, but who had once met his gaze with quiet kindness on a weary day. The memories did not come as sharp images. They came as feelings, as echoes of laughter, as the hush of silence between words. At the top, he found the great lantern. Its flame burned clear yet did not scorch. He leaned close, and within the glass he saw not fire, but scenes unfolding, like pages turning in the air. He saw his first steps, wobbling but determined. He saw the long afternoons spent staring at clouds, wondering what lay beyond them. He saw the small heartbreaks, the quiet recoveries, the ways in which his heart had broken open only to grow softer, never harder. But the most surprising thing was this: the lantern did not only hold his memories. It held the memories of others as well. A girl's first song whispered into the night, an old man's final letter left unfinished, a child's laughter echoing in an empty yard. The lighthouse gathered what people forgot, not to take it away, but to hold it safe. For memory, it seemed, was too precious to ever truly vanish. As he stood in the glow, he felt less like a single person and more like part of something vast. His life, his story, was stitched together with countless others, threads of kindness, sorrow, hope, and wonder, all woven into a single fabric. The beam of the lantern swept again, this time brushing across his heart. For a moment he felt the presence of everyone who had ever touched his life, those he remembered and those he had forgotten, those still alive and those long gone. All of them were here, their love glowing in the quiet flame. Tears welled in his eyes, but they were not heavy tears. They were light, falling like stars. He sat by the lantern for what felt like days, though time meant little here. And as he rested, he realized something gentle. Memory is not a chain. It is a lighthouse. It does not trap you in the past. It simply shines so you do not lose your way. When he finally descended the staircase, the whispers followed him, soft, reassuring, like voices saying goodbye without regret. He stepped outside again. The night was vast, the sea endless, but he no longer felt small. The light still turned, sweeping across the waters, carrying every memory safely forward, and he carried with him the warmth of knowing. Even the smallest moments are never lost. They live on, shining quietly, guiding us home. The night had grown long, yet here, in this dreamlike world, time did not weigh on him. The stars hung low, their light tender, as though they too were ready to rest. He had walked through gardens of dreams, rivers of forgotten names, forests that listened, and a lighthouse that held every memory close. Each place had whispered something into his heart, something that was never really new but always worth hearing again, that life is not about holding tightly, but about letting gently. At the edge of the sea, he found himself standing on soft sand. The waves moved in and out with the rhythm of breathing, like the whole world was slowly falling asleep beside him. There was no urgency, no last trial to face, only a deep quietness, like the earth exhaling. The wind carried the sound of voices, not loud, not sharp, but soft as lullabies. They belonged to everyone he had met on this journey. Some voices he knew, some he did not, but all of them belonged to the same vast, invisible family of souls who had walked before him, who would walk after him. "Rest," they seemed to say. "You have walked far enough for tonight." He lay down on the sand, and the grains did not feel cold or rough. They felt warm like an old blanket. The stars above drifted closer, as if bending to listen. He thought of his childhood, the room of soft echoes, the clock that forgot time, the blanket that remembered dreams. He thought of the friends who had walked with him, even silently, even briefly. He thought of the love that had been given to him in small ways, a smile, a hand, a presence in the quiet. None of it was lost. None of it was wasted. The waves whispered again, softer now. They did not sound like water anymore. They sounded like words fading into music. And with that, the voices said together, he drifted into the quiet arms of sleep. The stars dimmed, not in sorrow, but in peace. The sea hushed its song, and the night folded itself gently around him, as if the world was tucking him in. For in the end, there was no ending at all, only resting. Only the tender truth that even when we forget, even when we let go, we are still carried by love, by memory, by the quiet light that never leaves us. And so he closed his eyes not to disappear, but to continue, somewhere softer, somewhere brighter, somewhere beyond the last whisper before morning.